This is our review for week 7 of the Foundations course at Ashtanga Yoga Ann Arbor in fall of 2022. This week we added 2 more of the postures of the seated part of the primary series. So now you're doing a total of 6 seated postures. And next week I want to look at yet another subroutine within the seated postures and explain a little bit more about how this overarching concept of vinyasa, the sort of meta logic of the way things are put together, then breaks into subsets, subroutines that have a particular job to do when it comes to that overarching purpose of the primary series, which is yoga chikitsa. Yoga therapy, particularly therapy for the digestion of all forms of experience. To review, those 6 seated postures that you're doing now, the beginning of the floor work of primary, are 3 versions of a forward bend. First, there's an L sit here with the hands. Many of you are going to bend the arms so that the hands are still next to the hips. A few of us need to artificially lengthen our arms by releasing the sides of the shoulders down. We'll get more into that. A lot of that sense of, when we joke about just make your arms longer, it really does have to do with the upper trapezius and allowing the shoulder joint to release down. Then 2 more versions of this posture, Paschimottanasana. The first one holding the feet with the legs straight or bent, doesn't matter. The second holding the outsides of the feet, or maybe locking the hands beyond the feet. Then vinyasa, then purvattanasana with the feet on the floor. So you can take a sort of tabletop position here with the tailbone very far forward. Or if it makes sense from the point of view of your internal rotation in your femur bones, you can lift up here with the feet down. And vinyasa. Then, so those all go together, right? The beginning is kind of like a samastiti, right? Forward bend and a little back bend. Then the next thing we do is a deeper investigation of the rotation, and it's the range of motion in your femur bone, right? So at first, you take your time, you do external rotation. This is where we stopped and actually did a little kneading of the dough. So allowing the tissues of the thigh and the lower leg to start to receive the feedback from your own touch about going into deep external rotation. Both of these parts of the leg are externally rotating in a way that is particularly safe for most people's medial meniscus. So creating more space here, take the time. We talked about keeping the ankle straight instead of letting it sickle for those of you who have very movable ankles. So that's the first of these rotational moves. You take the right side first, then the left. Vinyasa is between everything. When in doubt, take a vinyasa. And then the next piece of it is the other end of that range of motion in the femur bone. So we go from external, then after the vinyasa, the femur bone is going to go in the opposite direction. So just notice your defaults. If this one is actually quite a bit more against your pattern than the external rotation, or vice versa, if this makes a lot of sense in your body. Most of us have one direction that the femur bones at first are more comfortable moving by default, right? So if this is a lot, you can, even as we discussed, elevate the straight leg hip to make sure that you start to train that internal move in the femur bone. Or at first, if you don't need the straight leg hip elevated for this to be safe, you might still take some of the weight out here so that you just are slowly training your joints to move in this way. You don't want the foot to be out like this, because that's just gonna encourage even more. Remember, we talked about pronation and supination. So if you overstretch the inside of the ankle, in general, it's a way to imbalance the ankle. So we want to keep the ankle joint straight here as well, which again might mean elevating the straight leg hip, right? Once that bent leg hip can comfortably start to tucked in, you might never touch the floor, then you can start moving your hands forward, maybe even to the foot. So that's the second subroutine. It's called Ardha Buddha Padma, Poshimatsunasana. Arta, you know it means half. Buddha means bound, because eventually there's a bind of the bent leg has a bent arm that comes behind it. Pudma, Poshimatsunasana, so half bound, lotus forward bend. Tiryang Mukha, Yekapada, Paschimattanasana is the compound word that refers to this shape. Tiryang, three angle, Mukha, usually extended. Yekapada, eka, you know, is one. Pada is one. So three angle extended, 1 foot, Paschimattanasana, forward bend. More to come on that, and what comes later is fewer words. We had a really long discussion, and I think we were in class till 12:30 yesterday. And in retrospect, I realized that a lot of the questions towards the end have to do with you all sort of figuring out what is the organizational model and value set that's helping determine the way that the shala is organized, vis-a-vis the way that Ashtanga is presented in gym or sort of yoga studio settings. And I've never really talked about the following in any detail, but I actually feel like going into a bit of theoretical view might just answer all those questions on its own. So this really has to do with the commodification of yoga, and in its sort of import and in some cases real appropriation in a sort of Western business setting for very good reasons and in support of a lot of efficiencies. The practice itself has been turned from kind of this highly individualized, bespoke, personal, relationship-based, spontaneous, highly interpretive, personal thing that you own yourself into a thing. Remember, we were talking about driste, the driste's tendency to take processes and turn it into things. Commodification is that. And so it's been sort of thingified into something that can be bought and sold in units of 90 minutes, in ways that are sort of always the same, that can be priced the same, right? And so there's a lot of efficiency in that. When Karl Marx wrote the most, to this day, clear and even beautiful description of commodification, it was because he was impressed by the incredible efficiency and naturalness by which human relations tend to create things. Right? It's the same internal process by which the mind objectifies, but then on a social, relational, sort of distributed level. That's in Das Kapital. I actually, if this is that interesting to you, like read that section that he's written on commodification, because it really like gives you a lens into these natural processes that are always surrounding us, are relentless, and are often like you can't resist them. But let's look at that in like when it comes to yoga. So, well, first let's think about like how does a tree get turned into a commodity? So a tree is, you could even say like a tree is a being, right? Each one is individual. It has its own personality. It's embedded in relations of other trees. It has its own history that you can even learn to interact with or understand by knowing the tree. And for the tree to become like board feet, it has to go through a process of the stripping out of its individuality, of its history, of any unique markings in its body. And it also has to be converted into something that can be priced in a predictable way, right? And so a board foot is not a tree. A board foot is just a unit of a thing that a tree has been converted to for buying and selling. It's really important that the board foot have the quality of transitivity.
So every board foot is like every other board foot, right? So that means that price can be continuous and the objects can be exchanged in a way that's the same across objects, right? So you can build markets out of that continuity and comparability and transitivity. So that's actually really useful in a lot of ways. And if you think of like the way that yoga, Ashtanga yoga, spread through a similar process of becoming, everything is the same, everything can be bought and sold in continuous units. There is a way that enabled Ashtanga yoga to be sort of picked up, passed around and spread through like modes where you don't have to have a lot of, for example, apprentice training or individualized instruction or personal knowledge, but rather if you have a certain sort of standardized training, then you can also learn to communicate and share standardized versions of yoga. So I do think that, you know, if Karl Marx are looking at this, but like, that's pretty impressive. There's a way that humans have figured out how to convert radical aliveness and individuality into things. And it is that exact process that is required for markets to be created. You can't really have, certainly not a global market, if the things are not commodified, if they can't be broken into individual, tradable, transitively comparable units with a stable pricing scheme, right? So this is, in yoga, it's pretty obvious how that would work, right? You would take units of time of 90 minutes, and so, you know, yoga is a service or a piece of entertainment, right? So it's not a thing, but it becomes a thing in this way that markets come together. And so those are the units of yoga that get bought and sold in exchange. Or maybe it becomes like a 200-hour training, right? And that can be like bought and sold in exchange, right? So that makes a lot of sense, because then anybody can, like in a market, markets are non-discriminating, right? Like anybody who has the money to be able to purchase that commodified unit of 90 minutes can buy and sell it, right? It means though that the other thing is that like relationships don't matter. What matters is transaction, right? And so the ability to be in that market is purely determined by whether you have the money to enter into these transactions. So the consequence for the thing of yoga is that it becomes highly, highly, highly standardized. So it has to be pretty radically redefined to be bought and sold in units of 90 minutes. The other thing that needs to be commodified is the unit of, or the labor of the teacher, right? So that's, I think, what can be very confusing around the shalas. I've gone to great ends to decommodify my labor because yoga's relationship. We're told, like in the Krishnamacharya tradition, yoga's relationship. So if my labor has a set price and is starts at one time and ends at another time and can be exchanged for money, and if you can pay me to teach you, and if I can be bought and sold, if like I could come at a price, like, which, you know, if that were the case, like I would just sell my labor to the celebrities who can pay the most, right? Then that means that the element of relationship is transactional. And in some cases, again, that can actually, transactional relationships are not evil, right? In some cases, like there's just a real clarity about there's this one thing that we're going to exchange, it's impersonal, and so there's still some sense of like a relationship, but it doesn't have the deep sort of yogic definition of relationship as we understand it, right? So there's two sides of commodification, of yoga per se, and then of the labor that goes into the yoga. Even though there are ways that like the natural emergence of that objectification for the sake of transaction and building a market, it's pointless to resist, because of the nature of mind and the nature of the way that people come together with that collective mindset. It's also quite contradictory to the yoga in our lineage. And so this is the reason I even bother to decommodify yoga per se and to decommodify my labor. If it would actually be easier and it would be good for business if both of those things, if I would simply go with the flow. Again, this is Marx, not from Capital, but from the Manifesto. He says, like, this is so relentless, this process of the creeping of markets into all nature of your life. And now, oh God, if he could see Instagram, right? But he said, all that is solid melts into air, all that is holy becomes profaned. And the idea is that your extant sort of meaningful things and your morality and your values are always like subject to the creeping nature of commodification into intimate life and into the nature of that's what you truly value outside of the realm of money, right? But there is always, as so many sociologists and people in my old discipline, economic sociology, have pointed out, there's always a huge portion of social reality that cannot be commodified, as much as people might try. One of the ways that I see this in the sort of the colonial project, and let's remember, like, another reason this is problematic is not just because yoga is relationship in our tradition, but also because it is commodification of natural resources and labor that is the essence of the extractive kinds of colonialism that have been practiced in the south of India for the last 500 years when it comes to removal not just of actual natural resources, but certainly cultural resources that themselves have been stripped down, de-individualized for the sake of transactional and commodified sort of give and take, right? So one of the ways that I really see this pushback into decommodification in that context is around child labor. So that is still very much going on. They're like the way that international markets work, especially in poor countries that are historically oppressed in sort of colonial relationships, is that the idea of whose labor and what nature of labor is commodifiable is always kind of being pushed up, right? So you will I also, like, on a farm did plenty of child labor, right? But certainly in sort of relations of production in poor countries, it is that line of like whose labor is commodifiable is, you can always see like the forces of commodification pushing into that, and then the forces of real blooming, buzzing life pushing back. And yoga itself, in its very nature, the more you resist it, or the more you understand it, the more you see that it resists that sameification. And that's kind of what I'm trying to get across with this group right now, is that the idea that the practice is one set thing, that it has a rigidity to it, is the very thing that I'm deconstructing. Like, the Ashtanga is absolutely a methodology, and there is a sort of set dogma around it, and that is only useful insofar as it provides a container for us to inhabit from the inside. So the internal experience of the methodology itself is the point, and it's actually that relation of the methodology which is always resisting commodification, because you'll harm your body if you try to follow it in a rote way that doesn't respect the body. That is always in relationship with the actual subjectivity of an experience, which can never be made into a thing, right? So when it comes to what is Ashtanga yoga, and what postures should I do, and how does this relate to the books that I have? Well, I will tell you, I own a lot of the books, but in general, the ones that you're reading, I have never read a word of them. The videos that you might be watching, I have never watched a second of them. And that really has to do with the fact that I want to be a being that has learned, this is my social experiment over 20 years, 20 plus, is can I learn and can I develop expertise without ever feeling like I'm responsible for the commodified versions of the yoga. I have only ever learned in relationship. The weird thing is, that means that there's nothing in my mind that, given that my mind can't always remember where and how I've learned every bit of technique, there's nothing in my mind that I've picked up from a source that was actually created with the mind of standardization for depersonalized exchange, right? And that is just purely my own weird economic sociologist brain that decided, also out of pure sentimentality, to only learn in relationship. At some point, very early, that landed for me. I was like, oh, yoga is a relationship. What does that imply for my brain, which is, in every other setting, I'm going to read all the books. I'm going to consume all the materials over my particular special interest, right? In this case, it actually helped me, by the nature of my own mind, check that process and just be that bit that we discussed yesterday about just accepting my own path at its own pace became the mode for me to learn in a decommodified way. So I don't recommend that for anybody in particular, but I do think that it makes interacting with me different, maybe, because I literally don't know what's in those books. I do know that they're wrong. And that's just because I hear that from teachers and colleagues that, people got these mistaken impressions, or actually literally wrong instructions from material that had been sort of frozen in the way that it always gets frozen when you put it down in a particular sort of, in a way as if that's the only right way, right? And so the more relational and fluid interpretation of the practice is really all I can offer, because of the ways that yoga coming through me has sort of resisted some of those other versions of what the practice is. And it's also I'm just trying to put together a neighborhood yoga school where everybody can have a practice they can do basically every day. That's the idea. It's not coming in for one 90-minute unit of a workout, but rather having something that is yours, that is not dependent on coming into a commercial setting where you are exchanging the commodified 90-minute unit of experience. And I will say, this process is in some ways very bad for business, and some of the difficulty that the shala has. If I were willing to have a more commodified version of what we're doing here, where you can come in and buy 90 minutes of experience and then go, it would be it would simply be a very different shala, and we'd also not have revenue problems, right? Because this would be it would be low commitment, low relationship, sort of transactional setting that in a lot of ways makes a lot of sense and runs very smoothly. But for me personally, the reward is in the relationship. And so as much as teaching is not about just looking for what makes me happy, because service doesn't always make you happy, there is an element of knowing that if I'm sad in my work and if I feel alienated from the sort of inner nature of the work, I won't be able to do it at my best. And it's actually one of the interesting takeaways about understanding commodities and the way that commodification works in the world, and learning to have the laser vision that helps you see that relentless process in place is very often, for us as human beings, there is a thing that happens when we as people are commodified, or when our labor is commodified, or when the fruits of our labor are commodified, and that's called alienation. Like, if you really feel that you have been made into an object, or your art and the beauty that comes out of your creativity is purely an object that is like all other objects, sometimes that can just be like, well, what's my inner being have to do with this? What's my inner light or my essence have to do with any of this exchange and creation of objects? And so that the idea of alienation is like a sense of being somehow separated from and the relationship between you and your activity and the people around you is somehow mediated by so many objects that you feel disconnected, right? And so I think it's really interesting that even outside of this understanding of how markets work, from very early, Krishnamacharya was teaching that yoga is relationship. It's keeping us in a much more soft and mutually aware, moment by moment, sort of not objectified connection with our own bodies and with each other. So that was a very long explanation, but maybe with that much I'll never have to explain any of my weird decisions ever again.